Hey guys, Solid here. Hope you're all doing well. Often I get the question on the channel, what should I go with? The WR250R or should I go with the CRF300L? Seems I've owned both of them and battle tested both of them. I thought today would be the perfect time to jump straight in. So let's start with the little blue whizzer, the WR250R. It makes a respectable 29 horsepower at 10,000 RPM and 24 Newton meters of torque at 8,000 RPM. Has a 930 millimeter seat height, 11.8 inches of travel. The suspension is fully adjustable, and the real winner here I think has a wet weight of 134 kilos, which is quite impressive for the category. Then we have Team Red, the CRF300L. It makes 27 horsepower at 8,500 RPM, and it makes 26.6 Newton meters of torque at 6,500 RPM. It has a seat height of 880 millimeters, so that's significantly lower for the shorter riders out there. It's 142 kilos wet, so it's a little bit heavier, and it has 11.2 inches of travel. And both bikes are 4-stroke EFIs with a 6-speed gearbox. The Yamaha's 250 I want to highlight is very impressive for its size. It has no right to be as good as it is for a 250cc engine. But unfortunately, when you put it up against the 286cc engine of the Honda's engine does feel stronger. While it is true that the WR makes more peak horsepower, if you've been riding any amount of time, you know that peak horsepower is basically pointless unless you're insecure about your reproductive regions. What really matters is where the power is made, and where I think the real point of difference is the torque. The Honda, while making less peak horsepower, makes more torque. It makes 26.6 Newton meters of torque over the WR250R's 24, and more importantly, it makes it significantly lower in the rev range. As a result, the Honda is harder to stall and a bit better at lower speed because it has a better ability at that tractor factor, that low end grunt of getting through stuff without having to rev the beans out of it. This also translates to a better highway experience as well. It's able to maintain highway speeds as well as overtaking better once you're at about that 110 kilometers per hour and above that, because you've got your power and your torque right on tap where the bike is sitting in the rev range at those higher speeds. Where the WR, you do need a little more planning to overtake. Because it's a little more revvy, it takes a little while for the WR to gather steam and get motion going. At the heart of it, both engines are extremely fun to use and capable of any scenario you throw at them. The WR wins no contest here. It's 134 kilograms wet, so if my 8th grade math serves me right, it's 8 kilograms lighter than the 142 wet of the Honda. Because of this, the WR really does make a case for the better single track weapon. This is if you're just looking at it on paper. Having ridden both of these multiple times on single track and really tested them out now, I can tell you that I cannot discern any difference in the handling, the flickability of the bike. I would even point out that somehow Honda has managed to make it feel less top heavy than the WR250R. I don't know how that works. Perhaps it's because of the center of gravity. Maybe the engine and the weight of the bike is a little bit lower because it doesn't have quite the travel of the WR. Picking up both of these bikes, I can't tell the difference in the 8 kilos, but I would encourage you to hop on both and see which one feels more natural to you if you can. I want to say that on paper the WR wins, but in reality it really is a negligible difference that the Honda hides its deficit quite well. The suspension between the two is a little bit of a tricky one. Now that might shock a few people because of all the hype publicity the Honda's got for having soft suspension. The WR250R on paper again wins. Fully adjustable suspension means a lot better adjustability if you're doing harder riding, if you're picking up the pace or you're carrying extra weight, or you're just larger than the average sized person. The CRF suspension is noticeably softer. I've talked about it before, and it's not as capable as the WRs on harder terrain, or if you're turning up the pace, or if you're just a really heavy, bigger bloke. You can bump up the preload to mitigate this, but it certainly doesn't have the fine-tuning adjustability of the WR250R. However, on the flip side, the slower trail riding on the 300L is a much nicer experience. That plusher suspension will just soak up all the ruts and the small bumps and give you a very gentle ride. It's like riding a lazy boy if you're just doing general easy trails. Whereas the WR will feel a little more flighty, the front will wander around and get knocked off course a little easier in my experience, and the bumps just feel a little bit sharper. Bigger riders need to be warned with the 300L though. You'll likely need to upgrade the suspension. I really think the 300L, if you can get your head around it or prepare it in your budget to upgrade the suspension, will really unlock the potential of this bike to just be a fantastic dual sport and really good at that soft enduro stuff. I think with suspension, the 300L is the unanimous small displacement unicorn dual sport. I also need to point out that the WR250R's fully adjustable suspension, it also isn't perfect. It does have problems with rebound dampening. So if you're in high compression scenarios, say you go over a jump or you're going through some really difficult whoops and you're wanting to turn up the speed, the dampening on the rebound is really poor. So it can have this pogo-like effect where it might try and fling you out of the seat. This happened to me maybe twice in the 5 years I owned my WR, but it is something you will have to address if you're wanting to really do that difficult riding and not have that pogo effect. Both bikes have suspension for different scenarios, but I think overall the WR does win the better suspension contest, unless you are a complete beginner. If you're really just starting out, I think the Honda suspension will serve you better. It's plusher, it will make you feel a little more confident early on, and then as you do increase in experience, you can upgrade the suspension if you want. Let's talk about the subframe, which I think the WR does win here. It has a removable subframe, so if it breaks, you can remove and replace it without major issues. The 300L has a welded subframe, so if it breaks, you're in for a bit of a headache. I certainly have noticed people freaking out lately because of the high profile subframe breakage of Itchy Boots on her 250L. All subframes have a breaking point regardless of who's manufacturing them. Pack light, pay attention to where you place your bags, and try and mitigate the strain to the subframe on whatever dual sport you're riding. They're not made for carrying the kitchen sink and your coffee machine. Both of these bikes' gearboxes are bulletproof, 6-speed gems of a thing. They're very reliable. I think the ratios are quite good for what their intended purposes are for, managing the highway all the way to the trails, and then the gearing is low enough to enjoy the experience off-road as well. Both of these bikes have gearboxes that have been battle tested for years. If you're not familiar, the 300L's gearbox is borrowed like the motor from the CB300 series with some changes in the ratios. I also think because of that slightly stronger motor, Honda have been able to leverage that by making the gear ratios slightly better for what the intended use of these bikes are. The Honda sits on the highway better, and it also has a slightly closer gear ratio, at least in the feel in my butt in the seat. It seems like it's suited slightly better to the slower speed stuff off-road riding. So it's only marginal. I certainly wouldn't put it on your list of things to decide one over the other, but it is a difference that I have noticed. So we are really splitting hairs here. Both gearboxes at the end of the day are fantastic. The WR has a clear advantage when it comes to accessories. There's absolutely every accessory you could imagine for the WR, so every problem has been addressed, every want and need has also been addressed. You can get an accessory for just about everything. But there are also heaps of accessories flooding into the market for the 300L. The one thing that's been holding the 300L back is the lack of a big tank so that you can really do that long multi-day adventure trips without having to be relegated from skipping from petrol station to petrol station. And I'm going to let you in on a bit of alpha information here. IMS haven't made this public yet, but I've been talking with them and they're currently in development of a 13+ litre petrol tank. Pre-orders should be available in Q1 of 2022. They haven't announced pricing, but it is in development. That is fantastic news, and I was really excited to let you guys know about that. Secondly, there's another thing to think about here. The WR250R, if you're not aware, was discontinued in 2020, so parts availability will really start to taper off as demand for new accessories tapers off, because a lot of the bikes that are out there that you can get on the secondhand market already have all the accessories you want. So the demand for accessories really isn't going to be there in the future for the WR250R. So think about the long-term accessory availability here. Price is a really tricky one to discuss here because it's highly correlated to your local region and what's going on in the market. A secondhand WR here is trading at a very high premium. In fact, I've seen WRs here for a couple of thousand more than a brand new CRF300L. They're kind of going for crazy prices at the moment. WRs have always had a premium because they've been more expensive brand new, so keep that in mind. You are getting a more premium package in my eyes over the CRF300L. It is marginal, but it definitely is there. The CRF, on the other hand, wins the reasonable price race by a big margin. I think the value for money for the 300L far outweighs the value for money on the WR. It's a very good value motorcycle, and if the WR250R was still sold today, it would still be $1,800 more right away. Let's talk about safety. I think this one is hands down clear cut. The Honda has ABS, so on the road, if you're doing commuting or you do a lot of road riding to get to the trails, ABS is just going to be a lifesaver, especially when you're in the wet on knobby tires. It's also very easy to live with. You hold down one button for 2 seconds and the ABS is off when you're stationary. No faffing about and endless sub menus to get it off. For the old school guys, if you don't want ABS interrupting you at all off-road, of course the WR250R is going to appeal to you. Both bikes are cockroaches, but the WR has a proven track record for basically being unkillable. The CRF's engine and gearbox have been around for years in other models and have just as good a track record as being unkillable. Given that it is in a new frame and it will have some new pieces in there, could be a few little niggles to work out over time. I think it's reasonable here to be very confident in the reliability of each bikes, but I will point out a few things on the WR. If you're getting an 08, so that's the first year of production of the WR, they did have trouble with the fuel pump on those, but on 09 afterwards, not a problem at all. They addressed that. There's also a little seal on the gearbox, and the WR250R also does tend to eat swing arm protectors, or what's called the chain guides. I basically needed to replace mine at about the 7,000 to 10,000 kilometer mark. The Honda, it really is early days, so I can't comment on stuff like that, but both dead reliable bikes, and I wouldn't have a worry in the world about going with either of them. If you're talking about how much you paid for the bike relative to the quality of the bike, I think it's very, very comparable here. The money you put into the Honda is significantly less than the WR250R if you were buying them new, and conversely, you get comparable levels of quality for your money. If you take away the purchase price, I think there is a strong case that the WR is marginally better in quality. If you put price back in as a factor, the fact that the Honda is such great value for money and you're still getting the quality you get in that Honda for 2021, it's a pretty good achievement in my eyes. But without it, the WR does win marginally in the build quality comparison. So let's talk about fuel consumption. The CRF obviously wins here despite its bigger displacement. It just has far more tech to throw at this problem now, given there's a decade between the production of each of these motorcycles. The WR, I was getting 23 to 27 kilometers per litre. On my CRF, I'm sitting between 29 to 32 kilometers per litre. A noticeable increase. It is only a small difference, but it definitely is better at getting further on the same amount of fuel. The WR, I was getting the fuel light at about 170, 190 kilometers, whereas the fuel light on my CRF comes on at about the 220 mark. The CRF also has a whopping 0.3 liters more fuel capacity. CRF does win this round, but it is splitting hairs. Let's talk about the forgotten difference makers here. Insurance is a big one. You might be able to insure one for cheaper than the other. Also consider your dealership experience. Does one do a better job of looking after the customer than the other in your region? Is one closer than the other? If one's an hour's drive away and the other one's 10 minutes down the road, that's going to make a lot of difference. Do you have a relationship with one over the other? Is it worth going that little bit more distance because one is a friend of a friend? Also, servicing costs. Which one will be cheaper for you? I think the Honda arguably will be the cheaper one to service, purely because it can go longer between its service intervals. There's lots of little things to consider, like the WR has a reusable air filter where you can clean it, re-oil it, chuck it back in, and it's good to go. Whereas the CRF has a one and done air filter until the aftermarket comes to its rescue. Okay, so both of these bikes have a strong case for the lightweight adventure unicorn mantle. They can do just about everything, but nothing particularly well. In my opinion, they're the perfect balance of weight, power, and reliability. I think the WR250R has a strong case if you really can't get yourself past wanting to upgrade the suspension on the CRF300L, and you're wanting to do that soft enduro kind of riding, and you do have those intermediate kind of skills to utilize fully adjustable suspension, especially if you're a bigger rider. The other reason I think is if you just want all the mods on your motorcycle straight away, you can pick up a secondhand WR with all the fruit on it. It's very hard to get your hands on a Honda at the moment because the motorcycle industry is just struggling to get bikes to its customers. So you've got a 6 to 8 month wait at the moment to get your 300L, which can be very frustrating. However, for me, having owned the WR250R for 5 years, and at that 5th year really felt like I needed to move on, and that's where the Honda's strength really shines through. It has that little bit extra oomph. I'm happy to upgrade my suspension, and I think it's going to make a fantastic lightweight dual spawn unicorn. It's also going to make the better bike if you're the beginner. You've got that lower seat height, the plusher suspension, which will help you out in learning to ride off-road, in my opinion. So I think it's the real ideal modern small displacement dual sport, and with that ABS, it's going to help out those learner riders as well in those brown pants moments on the road. Every bike is a pros and cons balance. You're going to fix some problems with one bike, but you're going to create others. So you do need to have a think about which problems you can and cannot put up with. I think with the addition of the bigger motor in the Honda, it's frog leaped to the WR250R as the better bike for the long multi-day trip adventure bike where you can load it up and just head towards the sunset. Ultimately, I chose the Honda and I have no regrets. I'm super happy with my decision to upgrade from the 250R to the CRF300L. And I hope the information I've given you today really helps you out so that you can get out on the trails and enjoy yourself out there riding. Because after all, it's about the experience. Don't get too caught up in what you're riding at the end of the day. So until next time, don't forget to stay shiny side up, and I'll catch you in the next one. See you later.